Olá, pessoal. Eu sou Fernanda Sauerbron, professora do Programa de Pós-graduação em Ciências Contábeis da UFRJ. Nós estamos aqui hoje no terceiro dia de atividades com o professor Jim Haslam, visitante aqui do programa. Nós estamos nesse terceiro dia, né? O professor Jim Haslam vai fazer uma apresentação sobre os contornos da contabilidade, né? Como é que a gente define a contabilidade, os limites da pesquisa na contabilidade. O professor Jim, já apresentado nos outros dias, convido a todos a assistirem os vídeos que estão gravados já no nosso canal do YouTube da FACC, da Faculdade de Administração e Ciências Contábeis da UFRJ, em que ele se apresentou e falou bastante da sua trajetória de pesquisa e diversos tópicos. Nessa manhã de hoje, então, nós vamos trabalhar essa temática e teremos ainda mais uma sessão no dia 3 de agosto, já estão todos convidados para participar aqui com a gente. Professor Jim, thank you for being here with us in this third day of activities. It's really fantastic. We are honored to have you here at UFRJ again. É um projeto CAP Sprint, com apoio para a visita do professor no Brasil, e do quanto nos orgulha muito tê-lo aqui conosco. Professor, the floor is yours. Anytime. Okay.
Obrigado, Fernanda.
Obrigada, Jim.
Bom dia, bom dia, also online. Thank you. This is the last session before the next one. There is a quote here from not very well known actually. The poet is very well known. A poet called Shelley. Shelley's wife wrote the novel Frankenstein. Have you read Frankenstein?
Yes.
Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley wrote the novel Frankenstein. And of course she outlived Shelley, who died tragically in a storm in Italy at the age of 22. But he wrote so many poems. He was able, I suppose, to be critical of his context, partly because he was a poet, and you were kind of excused if you were a poet. They almost didn't care too much what poets wrote. But he was fortunate not to end up in prison in the context in which he was writing. 1812 is 3 years before the end of the Napoleonic War. That was a very authoritarian context in Britain. As I say, he was a poet, and he spent a lot of his time outside Britain. This is from a poem called A Balloon Laden with Knowledge. A balloon that is full of knowledge. And here it goes. I'll try to say it in some sort of poetic way. A ray of courage to the oppressed and poor. A spark, though gleaming on the oval's earth, which through the tyrant's gilded dome shall roar. A beacon in the darkness of the earth. A sun which o'er the renovated scene shall dart like truth where falsehood yet has been. So what is Shelley referring to here in this poem? He's referring to knowledge. The sun is knowledge. A sun that darts like truth where falsehood yet has been. To provide a ray of courage to the oppressed and poor. I don't know, Tal, if you want to try to translate this into Portuguese. It's very difficult to do.
Yes,
if you want to have a go.
Yeah, I'm gonna say to the audience in the YouTube. Balão carregado de conhecimento, raio de coragem para os oprimidos e pobres, não uma faísca, embora brilhando na lareira do casebre, que através dos tiranos feitos dourados rugirão, o farol na escuridão da terra, sol que sobre a cena renovada lançará como a verdade onde a falsidade ainda esteve.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that does make it clearer. That's great. You know, you've got a reference here to a beacon in the darkness of the earth. So that's about light. That relates to the Enlightenment notion. So there are references here to enlightenment and knowledge. Again, to bring my old friend back into the story, Jeremy Bentham. Bentham used to meet lots of people. He was associated with a kind of anti-poetic thinking. But this is actually not a very full picture of Bentham. He did make jokes about poetry. He even wrote poems that were kind of silly poems occasionally.
Jim, sorry to interrupt you. I think your mic is off. Can you change for this one?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. No problem.
Hopefully, this is a better one, and everyone can hear and as well as online. Okay. The poem is making reference to light, a beacon in the darkness of the earth, and hence to the Enlightenment. The sun is knowledge, the name of a newspaper which perhaps doesn't have a great deal of good knowledge in it these days, but you know, the Sun is a newspaper in the UK. So it is associated with that idea of knowledge and communication. And dark light truth. So you've got the rays that are coming in, you know, the sun is providing rays of courage to the oppressed and poor. So through the process of illumination, enlightenment, the oppressed and the poor will somehow overcome their oppressors and have more fulfilling lives. Even though it seems to be such a small thing at the moment, even though it's just a spark almost that's going out, you know, a spark almost going out, but it's still gleaming on the Hubble's earth. Reference to tyrant, which Shelley often does this in his poems because he saw the British government as essentially tyrants, as an authoritarian regime, which it really was. I mean, I was just referring to my old friend Jeremy Bentham, who did have a sort of reputation as being anti-poetic, or he certainly has got that these days. However, it's clearly not the full picture. He did sometimes joke about poetry, even writing sort of silly poems to himself sometimes. But looking into his daily life, one of the things that he did was to meet people in the afternoon. He used to do his writing in the morning. He was an eccentric man who lived by particular rules. So at about lunchtime, well, not about lunchtime, I think it would be precisely 12 o'clock, someone brought in some ginger biscuits and a coffee. Just like me, you know, coffee all the time. And matchy, yeah, should have had matchy, but he was having coffee, and then in the afternoon he would meet various people to try to influence them and be influenced by them, and so he was, if you like, an activist in the afternoon, in that sense of political activism, and in the morning he did his writing. I noticed that one person that he met quite regularly was a man called Thomas Love Peacock, who was not a very famous romantic poet, more or less on the edge of the romantic movement, really. But he was really a romantic poet, I think. And he did have some radical ideas as well. I don't think similar to Shelley, but he was quite a radical poet. I thought it was interesting that Bentham met regularly with Thomas Love Peacock to discuss these things. And I know that Bentham did say at one point, oh, the poets seem to get it right, don't they? You know, the poets seem to actually be expressing what's really going on. But he himself was very careful about what he actually wrote in public. Most of what he wrote was kept hidden from the public because he didn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to end up in prison. He did visit prisoners who had written things against the government, quite famous people who had ended up in prison by being critical of the government at this time. The British government, the British establishment, if you like, during this period was very authoritarian and very different from the government that, for example, Karl Marx and Lenin met when they did their writing in Britain later in the century. When Britain actually then had a reputation for very liberal views. You could write what you wanted, you could say what you wanted. It was that sort of tradition, and that contrasted markedly with the tradition in many countries in continental Europe. So Marx found himself in Britain at that time, but Marx would have found it difficult to write his texts and get them published and have them published at the time of Bentham. It's very interesting that the Enlightenment and knowledge are obviously closely related, but also we must appreciate, as Burchell et al. Did, you know that paper in Accounting, Organizations and Society by Burchell et al. In 1980, the role of accounting in organizations and society. It doesn't put statistics, it puts statistics, and that is to reflect that the original meaning, or one of the original meanings of statistics, was Staatswissenschaft, the German Staatswissenschaft, which means knowledge again, of the state. Knowledge of the state doesn't necessarily mean numbers or a particular mathematical application of numbers. It means knowledge of the state. It came later to mean what we understand it today. And there's quite a few texts on that which you can have a look at. So knowledge again is referenced there. And there's another link there to Bentham, because Bentham was associated with the development of statistical societies in his particular context. And it was societies that would discuss the state, would discuss the society using knowledge of the state. And this became a mixture of kind of quantitative tables and narratives that people would use to discuss. There was also political economy clubs, where political economy meant what we might call economics today. Accounting publicity was also, of course, promoted by Bentham as a common expression at the time. And it was about disclosing openness to the world. Publicity was about openness to the world, making public, making visible to the world, publicity. Linked to notions of democracy, you know, radical democracy. That was a big movement towards the end of Bentham's life that he associated with. He kind of had friends and so on who were in Parliament advocating that sort of perspective. Bentham himself had a view of democracy which was very similar to the current kind of British way of thinking about democracy, which is that everyone should be able to vote unless they are mentally incapacitated to vote. That was his position. Probably would have advocated something like proportional representation or something a bit more effective than what we actually have in the UK today. But he was clearly a supporter of democracy. He thought that if the masses of the people were in control, if you like, that would make it a better society, just because they would have to be listened to. At the same time, like John Stuart Mill after him, he thought it was incredibly important to educate people so that they would have a chance of being active citizens with responsible perspectives. So he was a great believer in mass education. Now, at the time, these kind of ideas were definitely there. You can look at the parliamentary papers, especially after 1820, and you will find debates on education and accounting, publicity and statistics, and so on. And you will find reference to these as threats to society, So for instance, as I mentioned the other day, accounting publicity. If we require the banks to publish information to the world, what will people want next? What will people want next? This is going to lead to a revolution. I mean, I'm paraphrasing words that were actually used. This will lead to something like the French Revolution. So, you know, the accounting that we all are familiar with these days and we think is very conservative and we don't think it's particularly radical or progressive was seen as something that would lead to a revolution. Quite interesting insight. And education, you had people standing up in the parliament and they would say, oh, we can't educate the masses. We can't be so inclusive and educate the masses. What's going to happen? What's going to happen if they're educated? They're going to take over. And so, you know, these kind of views were expressed explicitly. Of course, you wouldn't hear those views today. Not even the most right-wing kind of politician would express anything like that today. It's just unthinkable that they would do that. I mean, our main institutions are all seen as operating in the public interest. So if you get a minister, say, of education in the corner and you're pressing them, what is the role of education? You know, what is the role of education? They have to say it's for public good. They have to say that in the end. They have to say that. Whether they translate that into their practice is a different question, but that is what they would say. It's the same with accounting, you know, like all the professional bodies pretty much in the world, somewhere in their charters, they refer to operating in the public interest. You know, that's what they do. Almost like a cartoon where they were envisioning three dimensions. One was accounting as it is, accounting in the current context, accounting as it is. And it included a vision of a better accounting in a better context, which by its nature might be much more difficult to articulate than accounting as it is in the current context. And then the midpoint between the two was the tension or transformation, the envisioning of something that will change the left-hand side towards the right-hand side of the diagram. The whole diagram can be understood as praxis. Oh, let us understand praxis and then think about changing it. The three things are going on together. The vision that you have of a better world informs, for instance, how you understand the current one and gives you ideas for changing it. Even the characterization of the world as it is and the characterization of the world as it should be, or a better world, is already praxis. Praxis is not only the thing in the middle. Accounting occurs at the three dimensions of the diagram, and the individual is there within the context, so they are shaped by the context. So the principle of reflexivity suggests that we need to be very careful about how strong we put these arguments, how strong we make arguments about accounting. But at the same time, we inevitably change the world. So the question is, how do we change it? The question is, can we change it in a way that is for the better? Illustration from 1991, which is mainly focusing on the left-hand side of that diagram, which most critical work does, of course. And it's trying to understand accounting in practice, trying to understand accounting change, and trying to see how accounting can transform from a practice that is supportive of the established order to a practice that is challenging the established order. How can this happen? And the focus is on conventional accounting. I'm going to say a bit more about conventional accounting later in the session. But it's not, for instance, counter accounting that we're focusing upon. It is not social and environmental accounting that we're focusing upon, but conventional accounting. But our argument is that conventional accounting can, in certain contexts, function as if it was counter accounting. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Now we didn't articulate the idea that we did later that emancipatory and regressive or emancipatory and repressive forces are at work together through in and through every phenomenon such as accounting. We didn't articulate it that way. So our way of articulating it was to stress the substantive nature of these phenomena. In other words, accounting was repressive because it was supporting a problematic order, and then it became emancipatory because it was challenging, it was seeking to change that order. And so we stress that difference rather than the relativism of that difference. So what happened? This was Germany in the First World War, and it's quite interesting actually. We had Selina and Monica here yesterday, and they were talking about inflation in Argentina. and Argentina is a country that's had very serious inflation at various points in its history, including today. And we can think of other examples. A good example would be Zimbabwe in Africa, where incredible inflation occurred. Now, these notions of inflation are referred to as hyperinflation. And I think it's the case that the International Accounting Standards Board still has a standard for contexts of hyperinflation. That's the remaining legacy of the 70s when these things were taken, you know, the notion of inflation accounting was taken more seriously. The initial project that we had was to consider the hyperinflation in Germany, because in the period before the rise of the Nazis in Germany, you had the massive hyperinflation occurring, which was having all kinds of negative impacts on the German society. So we kind of had this question. So what would have happened to accounting in the context of hyperinflation? By the way, I still think it's an interesting project, but that was our initial question. And we were going to trace how the accounts appeared in the newspapers and then presumably would have been rubbished, because they would have been rubbish, I guess. You know, the account in the context of hyperinflation, where, you know, you literally go in the morning with a wheelbarrow of money to buy a loaf of bread. And then, it might be a metaphor, I'm not sure how metaphorical it is. And then in the evening, you have an even bigger wheelbarrow, you know, that you come back with. Anyway, we found some interesting things. But in the context of looking for things, we came across a big story about accounting during the First World War. And we found this story really interesting. It was a story around Daimler-Benz. Daimler, of course, famous today, Benz for Mercedes-Benz cars. In those days, Daimler was making a lot of military equipment. And Daimler-Benz were kind enough to give us access to the archives that they had in Stuttgart. And so I must admit, my German is not particularly strong, especially when the German is in Gothic scripts. It's very difficult to read. But we were coming across things, and you know, eventually we realized that there's something really exciting here that was occurring. There seemed to be a scandal whereby Daimler were making profits out of the war. So they were making significant profits out of the war, but trying to hide the profits through their accounting system. They were trying to hide the profits through the accounting system, using fairly conventional accounting techniques in Germany. At the time, it was perfectly acceptable for German companies to create what they called stille Reserven, silent reserves. And these silent reserves, of course, impacted the disclosure of profit, reduced the disclosure of profit. So they increased the stille Reserven during this period. And they also did some interesting things with figures like earnings per share. If you issue lots of shares, and one of the techniques they used was to issue effectively bonus shares, certainly a lot of rights issues, to issue shares without really receiving a lot of money. But if you issue lots of shares, it deflates your earnings per share figure. So they were doing simple things like that in order to disclose earnings per share that were not so different from prior to the war, and to indicate that their profits were not particularly high. Incidentally, the scandal can be illuminated further by the fact that during that time, the German companies, and I think companies across Europe at the same time, were selling to each other. Can you imagine that? So they, all these people were being treated in such an incredibly dehumanized way and killing each other. And at the same time, the factories and the companies were selling weapons to each other. Can you imagine that? I mean, you know, war itself is a scandal, we know that, but, you know, when you hear about things like that, it's sort of incredible. Anyway, these dimensions of scandal came out, and eventually accounting, which had been seen as a very noble endeavor, and we actually document evidence for this prior to the First World War, where the accounting is linked to the law, and this is linked to German economic growth, and, if you like, the foundation of a welfare state in Germany. It was seen in very positive terms, accounting, prior to the First World War. Academically, it had a good reputation. Many interesting texts on accounting written in the early 20th century in Germany. But this particular episode became big news. And I don't know if you can imagine a newspaper that is mass circulation. I know it's a bit different these days with online media, yes. But in those days, there were newspapers, and you know, the time when I was born as well, for instance, there were newspapers that had these kind of mass circulations. And you would never get accounting on the front page of those papers. Okay. Maybe you would get accounting on the front page of, say, the Financial Times, or, you know, the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal. That's the kind of thing where you would get accounting being mentioned. And if you look, you occasionally do get accounting on the front page of those newspapers. But to have accounting on the front page of a newspaper that is mass circulation was extremely unusual. But it occurred during this period because, you know, you had these headlines: profits rising, workers falling.
And you know, Jim, this topic that you're raising is really important nowadays.
Yeah. Yes.
Posso falar alto? Fica aberto? No, I don't need to do my. Say it's working from here. It seems to be a really important topic nowadays. There were some papers in accounting on accounting of war.
Yes.
And I don't know if they recuperate that specific moment.
Yes, there are some really interesting papers on accounting of war.
And nowadays, there are some newspapers that are showing that guns that are being held to Ukrainian war were found in Paris, in those riots, the current riots in Paris.
Oh.
Yes, so probably this geopolitics and how the USA, UK, German gun industry, they are selling and providing weapons to the Ukrainian war. They're increasing their profits, and Ukraine is redistributing and reselling older guns or even the new ones to other situations around the world.
Yes, when you see this, war kind of illustrates such a negative dimension about our world.
And you can see that accounting can be at the center of the global geopolitics.
Yes, this idea that accounting is hiding the profit making or the exploitation of that situation.
Yes, exactly. And the explosion of violence in different contexts.
It's just such an extreme thing. It's quite incredible to see that. And of course, at the same time as we've got wars today, we have the environmental crisis.
Yes.
It's such an incredible juxtaposition of events. It really does kind of underline a really dark side of humanity when you analyze these things. And sometimes it's difficult. I mean, you know, German critical theory itself had a big problem because with the Second World War and all the events of the Second World War, such as the Holocaust, they had a big problem, you know, about is there any hope for the future, you know, this kind of thing. I mean, is it possible to talk about progress when we see things like that? I mean, I personally think you've just got to try and find it. You've just got to find it, start reading what the Hubble says. That to me is what you've got to do. Okay. So the aura of accounting changed. That's what we argued. The aura of accounting changed. It used to be seen as a noble, worthy activity linked to the law and a legitimate state in Germany. It then was seen as a corrupt practice, helping to hide profits on behalf of a much less legitimate regime and set of actors. Also, the accounting was being used by different people. So the accounting was being used by political activists who were trying to bring about the social revolution in Germany. In 1919, they almost managed to achieve a revolution that would have been similar to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Some of the leading figures in that, like people like Rosa Luxemburg, were interested in using the accounting dimension to promote the revolutionary campaign. So the usage changed, the users changed. Instead of investors, you have Rosa Luxemburg involved in using the account. The content was very similar. Content didn't really change in that particular example, because most of the stories we have about accounting being transformed and having a positive effect and having a progressive effect relate to the content. In this case, the content didn't really change. The form did, you know, from the back pages of the newspaper or the inside covers of the newspaper to the front page of mass media. That's changing the form. Because the form can be all about the media that it's in. And of course, these days we've got so many more media to think about. The form can actually be about the media. The form can actually be about whether it's, say, quantitative information or financial information or narrative. Again, all those things are form. And we know, you know, when we look at accounting in practice, that those things change over time. And then it can be paper-based or online. That's also form, that's different media. And it could also be the aesthetics, if you like, or the way the numbers and the narratives are represented. Is everything a kind of order here? Or is it a bit messier? And what is the significance of that in terms of the form of the accounting and its consequences? For that. Usually, the way that reconstruction occurs is there's a kind of association of a bad accounting with something that's in the past. So, you know, all those events, there's something in the past. So accounting is okay now. You know, that's usually what happens. There are kind of less dramatic things that professional accountancy bodies do in comparison. For instance, the International Accounting Standards Board changed its name. More or less, that's all it did. I think that was 2001, when the International Accounting Standards Committee became the International Accounting Standards Board, partly to mirror the United States Financial Accounting Standards Board that it was trying to forge a relationship with, but also in response to scandal. The idea is, we're different now. We've got a new name at least, but that was emphasized, we're different now. Some people think all it really did was change its name. Gallofer and Haslam 2019. Just before that, here's some interesting quote. I was looking at the Accounting and Emancipation book yesterday, and this is published in 2003. By the way, you can get it online. It's very easy to get it online. So I will send the link, Fernando, to yourself. But if you put into Google Scholar Accounting and Emancipation 2003, Gallofer and Haslam, what should come up is the book. And the version exists online. It's easy to get it online as an electronic book. I found this quote from Shelley. But here's some more quotes from our friend Jeremy Bentham, kind of indicating what kind of aura, if you like, Bentham wanted to give accounting, just how significant he thought it was. I'll read out the full quote. I've got fragments of it there. This is the full quote. From the art of pauper economy, which means economy related to the poor, from the art of pauper economy, studied with any attention, the transition is unavoidable to the ministering art of bookkeeping. In other words, if you think about the poor and trying to do something for them, it's unavoidable not to study the ministering art, the regulatory art, the management art, the governance art of bookkeeping. And then he says, the cries of the poor called aloud and accelerated the demands for it. Bookkeeping. He's talking about bookkeeping. It's kind of strange to read this. In the 18th century, that was written. And then in a letter to the famous agriculturalist, and at that point I've forgotten his name, what's the man who invented the crop rotation system in agriculture? Arthur Young. Nothing to do with Arthur Young in accounting. Not, Arthur Young, the famous partner of one of the big accounting firms in the country. Ernst & Young, of course. That's come from Arthur Young. Yes, but it's not the same. It's not the same Arthur Young. Arthur Young, the agriculturalist. In his letter, he says about bookkeeping again. Without this advantage, in other words, bookkeeping, without which he uses as a paraphrase of as a parallel to accounting or to publicity. Without this advantage, everything would be too much. With it, nothing will be too much, which is an extraordinarily hyperbolic, exaggerated kind of argumentation. So without bookkeeping, everything would be too much. With it, nothing would be too much. Quite an extraordinary thing to say, quite an extraordinary thing to write. And then he says, if the season were not over for heathen deities, in other words, if we could still create heathen deities like they did in ancient Greece, so if the season were not over for heathen deities, a goddess, a muse at the least, ought to be for bookkeeping. Should be a goddess of bookkeeping. That's what he wrote. But by the way, this bit is crossed out in the letter. I'm not even sure if the letter was sent. So, interesting question in terms of historical research. Can you use text that's been crossed out? Well, we say it's been crossed out. we think it's interesting that that was written and then crossed out. Bentham is not going to sue us. Yeah, Gallagher and Haslam 2019 is quite interesting, the second half of that paper, in terms of social analysis, critical social analysis. It's trying to argue that many different forms of social analysis today can be interpreted as having some relationship to the construct of emancipatory accounting, the way we presented it. The notion that emancipatory and regressive forces interact, run through accounting, and are evident in accounting practice at the same moment in time. At the same moment in time, accounting is a mix of the emancipatory and regressive. And the challenge that we have is to make it more emancipatory and less regressive. Not perfectly emancipatory, because we're talking about something that is impossible really to achieve, or it would be only achieved by some sort of special chance. But the balancing of the emancipatory and regressive in such a way that we make the accounting more emancipatory. And trying to argue that many theories just don't want to say that. They just don't want to be explicit about that. They don't even want to be explicit about their critical nature. And they certainly don't want to suggest that the papers and their analyses offer a hope that accounting can actually play a better role in society. But it's there, or at least it can be rescued. And the possibilities of synthesis between the different theories is what we're getting at. A tradition that we think is an issue in accounting today. Finally, on that slide, I have not mentioned yet immanent critique, which is one of the approaches to critical analysis in critical theory. Immanent critique is not as strong as the approach indicated in the critical systems model, but nevertheless can be connected to it in principle. Immanent critique is basically taking the form of challenging institutions by reference to what they say about themselves. So, for instance, the accountancy profession says it serves the public interest. So when Prem Seeker writes about the accountancy profession, or You Will Not writes about the accountancy profession, and they write accounting is not serving the public interest, they are challenging what the accounting profession says about itself. Now, I think when an institution declares something about itself, it's already a positive moment. Because if it was really so powerful, it wouldn't need to actually say that. It's already acknowledging that in principle, what it is meant to do is to serve the public interest by actually writing it, by actually stating it. For me, that is something positive. For me, that is already a progressive moment. Even if, of course, it can be used to try to legitimate something and hide something and display something that is actually negative, even if it's different from what they actually might do. The point is that from the perspective articulated in Gallagher and Haslam 2019, and in another paper with Claire Roberts and Lisa Monk on online reporting and counter-accounting, it's that idea that if companies express that they're doing good or trying to do good, it's already a positive moment, because other people can then turn around and say, did you do that? This is what you said you were going to do. This is what you report. This is what you're holding yourself out as doing. And it's a good thing, yes, but what have you actually done? So this is the nature of immanent critique. How is it related to the critical systems model? It's related to it because it contributes to a problematization of practice. It's pointing out that accounting in practice is something less than it claims to be. And that is already a problematization of practice, which may then be suggestive of a better accounting in the future. Were the institution is making a generic statement like the public interest, then it's going to be very close to the critical systems model. But if it's a much narrower notion that's really very time-specific or context-specific, immanent critique would not strongly relate to the critical system model, but it could still open up a questioning of current institutions that might lead to notions of better praxis as well as better appreciations of systems. I was asked by Fernanda, I think it was yesterday, about historical analysis, critical historical analysis. And if you think about the diagram, in a strange way, when you do history, you're kind of looking on the left-hand side of that diagram and going back in time in a way, going back to a different context. And going back in time in that sense is a bit like researching a different context today. So if, for example, as a UK writer in a UK context, I was to do a study on Brazil, that would be a different context. And I am, in effect, experiencing something that's a little bit like going into a different time. I'm not suggesting that Brazil is backward or anything like that. I'm merely making the parallel between researching the other, or the other context, which could actually be even another individual, or even thinking about yourself in the past or something. So when I use the word other, I'm using it in a very general sense. I'm making a parallel between researching the other and researching the historical context. There is a quote, I think it was G.K. Chesterton, I'm not sure. The past is a foreign country. The past is a foreign country, which kind of summarizes that idea in a way. And there's a lot to be gained from trying to overcome your ethnocentricity, your Eurocentricity, what some people call chronocentricity or historicity, where in the past you look at it from the present and you don't try in a serious way to understand the past as it was in the past. We're not going to be able to access that fully, just as we're not going to be able to understand others fully. However, we can try to understand them, and we can try to understand the past, and we can try to put ourselves in the position of the past and be open to thinking about it. But not just that, we can then get insights from the past in terms of understanding better the present. We can try to understand better the present because we can realize that, that's why accounting practice developed like that, That's why it developed like that. And people don't really know that today, People don't really know, for example, that once the accounting practice that they think is very conservative and is somewhat taken for granted was seen as a radical progressive idea that would lead to a revolution. They don't know that. it's been forgotten, hasn't it? It's been covered under layers of history, and there's so many things like that that have been covered under layers of history, and you get a better understanding of the present by tracing them through. The other thing is difference about the past. The difference of the past can be a radical moment because you realize the difference and you think, that really is like a new idea from the past that was covered over. And so that idea suddenly becomes relevant for thinking about the future and envisaging a better world and maybe changing the world. Those are ideas that directly can relate to that from the past, just as we can get these ideas from thinking about the other. All these things are going on in an historical project, so history has got all kinds of critical dimensions to it. And there it is, summarized on that slide. Don't worry, Bentham fans, there's another quote from Bentham coming soon. Accounting delineation, we talked about it before, the notion of accounting at large, what is this big idea that accounting is, and everything else in our thoughts and in our practices are particularities of this, particular examples of this. What's the big idea of accounting? And I made the point that accounting is actually so big that it is almost meaningless to try to define it in that big way, except that it can be used to counter prejudice against more, prejudice against those who think that accounting has to be one thing, like it's just one thing. It's like accountancy practice, say, the profession. And if it's not that, it's not worth studying. So I think it's useful for that. It's definitely useful for that. I'm not sure what else it's useful for, to be honest, because it really is the particular accountants that are interesting. But here's some quotes from Bentham, just to show that he was thinking about these issues. I'm not sure if you can read that. I had real problems making this slide, as you can see. But I'll read it out. Pecuniary economy, in other words, financial economics, you could say. Pecuniary economy, usually regarded as the sole object of bookkeeping, will here be but as one out of a number, for the system of bookkeeping will be neither more nor less than the history of the system of management in all its parts. Really interesting quote, Bentham, 18th century. And then this is a totally different quote. So I actually wanted to create a space between this first quote and the second one, because I think the second one was written in a like 10-year gap of the first one. The second one, the commercial process or operation on the subject of which, under the name of bookkeeping, works in such multitude have been published. There's been a lot of text on bookkeeping, like the conventional commercial bookkeeping, double entry and so on, is but a branch, a particular application of an art of the most extensive range and proportionable importance. Is the art of bookkeeping a branch. Fascinating quotes from the past. Written at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. You can find them in the Gallup and Haslam book 2003. Chapter 2 is about Bentham. It's called Jeremy Bentham, Accountant. And the reason is that was used as his signature in one of his letters to the government. Jeremy Bentham, Accountant. Which again is very interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why the G has suddenly appeared. Something's gone wrong there. It wasn't wrong when I put it in, but it's wrong now. Maybe I didn't double check this. Now, these are categories that we actually did discuss. We've discussed. We're going to take them a bit further today. We talked about conventional accounting, and I've summarised the possible definition of it there. Understood by mainstream practice and professionals as the mainstream, and often translated in that way by academics as well. Social accounting, and I've tried to summarise this: accounting and accountability for social impact and or adherence to social norms. Now you might say, but isn't conventional accounting part of that? Well, yeah, there are lots of debates about that. You could talk about the overlap. Definitions of these things have always puzzled accounting writers. You know, it's very difficult both to define accounting in a big sense, and even some of the categories are difficult. Environmental accounting and accountability for environmental impact and or adherence to environmental norms. Shadow accounting, accountings from beyond government and business organisations. Accountings from beyond government and business organisations. One of the key writers in that area was Colin Day, and also Rob Gray. But Rob at the beginning didn't see it as accounting. I think I mentioned that before. But it was a big thing of Colin Day's work. By the way, if you're wondering why I haven't put silent accounting in, people don't really refer to it much these days. Again, Colin wrote a lot about silent accounting, and so did Rob Gray. But silent accounting really is a kind of social accounting that appears implicitly, if you like. Not really. It doesn't really promote itself as social accounting, but it is found in conventional accounting statements or narratives around conventional accounting statements. It's known as silent accounting. And then counter-accounting is accountings challenging the established order. So you can see that counter-accounting is a form of shadow accounting. Now, going back to Bentham again, he had this idea that the government itself, and you can imagine maybe a company itself doing this as well, would pay someone to criticise it. Which is a bit of a naive view, but that's what Bentham did argue in his case for unofficial publicity, what he called unofficial publicity. Well, that's a kind of counter-accounting, I guess, but most counter-accounting is going to be shadow accounting, a form of shadow accounting. And in fact, in practice, these two things are often the same. People who write about shadow accounting almost always mean the same thing as counter-accounting. Ellen Tredigger's work, she doesn't really refer to counter-accounting, but she is clearly writing about that and calling it shadow accounting, which is fine. Shadow accounting is the bigger idea. Strictly speaking, it's slightly bigger than counter accounting because it includes any shadow accounting.
Yeah. I always, my mistake surely, I always thought that shadow accounting was a form of counter accounting. In which
it's the other way around.
Oh yeah. Now you're explaining, because I thought that shadow accounting was when you get one specific report in corporation and you do an exactly opposite report, challenging one by one, you know?
Yeah, in practice, when people do refer to shadow accounting, that's what they mean.
Yeah.
That's usually what they mean. But when you refer to challenging, you're into the language of counter accounting.
Okay.
But a shadow account literally means an account that is produced beyond businesses and government. So not someone from the government preparing it, not someone from the business preparing it, but an quote independent person preparing it. And if you think about it, such an account doesn't necessarily have a challenge.
Okay.
But almost certainly will do. Do you see the point? Yeah.
I always think that we can separate two from three, because environmental accounting, or at least you have two different environmental accounting.
Yes.
You can think about environmental accounting just for the environment, for the norms, for the regulations, and you can think about environmental accounting, which what I really follow, as regarding the social impact.
Yes, I agree entirely. I agree with that.
Basically, at the beginning was the difference between Caesar and Neiman,
Yes.
but now not anymore because
No,
one is much
I
more.
fully agree with that. Indeed, these almost these three categories can be considered together in some ways, and certainly these two, because if you take seriously this idea of environmental impact, adherence to environmental norms, you will naturally enough be interested in this, and vice versa as well.
An interesting thing is in Brazil, like 2 or 3 decades ago, one NGO created a word that now we use, which is the combination of social and environment.
Yes.
Socioambiental, it's
Social environmental, like social historical.
Yes.
as one word.
As one word,
They were 2 different words, but then this NGO, like 2 decades ago, they created the idea of we can separate one from the other.
Yes.
And we've been using those words together
Yes.
since then.
Yes, that's right. And you know, coming back to sort of almost including this because it's also related to the social, you know, there is forms of accounting in practice, even standards in practice, that actually relate across the 3 levels. So you've got integrated reporting, you've got the Global Reporting Initiative, triple bottom line, which is part of the Global Reporting Initiative. So, yeah, these 3 things are often discussed together, but I certainly agree with you about the very close relationship. I mean, especially around the word sustainability. You know, when the word sustainability is used, you're often merging the social and environment. You know, sustainability accounting, which I haven't put on this. overview. I mean, there will be things I miss out. You know, key terms and words that I miss out for sure. So, just looking at conventional accounting and also change of accounting, change of conventional accounting. First of all, I think it's very interesting that narrow notions of the conventional can be deployed rhetorically, such as in the expression, "this is not accounting." This is the point, you know, when some people would say, "Oh, that's not accounting because it's narrative." That's not accounting because it's actually about the well-being of the workers, you know. Or that's not accounting because it's about the impact of the organization on climate change. You know, this kind of argument. That's not accounting. And you know, this is important to be able to counter that notion. Incidentally, it's a very poor strategy for the accountancy profession to have, because to the extent that the accountancy profession has that strategy, it's almost undermining itself. Because when we think about the future, it's almost certain that the accountancy profession will have to get into all these different things in order to keep the status that it has. You know, this tendency to argue things like that is not accounting does undermine itself. Accounting is determined by the professional experts. You can see a form of this operating in the European Union. In the European Union today, I think it's from about 1985 that the International Accounting Standards Board's accounting standards are applied or need to be applied by every company that is listed on stock exchanges in the European Union. That's been the case since 1985. So people say, "Oh, how can the European Union do that?" You know, I mean, I think it was Giappello and other writers. You know, they've kind of argued what a massive giveaway to the profession, and you know, not a democratic thing at all. You're giving power to professional experts. What happens in practice is that also the professional body has to give something as well, because the EU has to approve the standards as part of its legislation in order for that rule to be implemented at the level of the EU. And occasionally, but it is only occasionally, the EU says, oh, we don't like that standard. Or actually, that standard is going to be debated and we're going to investigate that standard. It does happen occasionally, but it doesn't happen very often. It happened with International Financial Reporting Standard number 8. It happened with International Financial Reporting Standard 21, I think, on financial instruments.
There is a question from Luciana.
Yes.
I think it's similar to Yara's question.
Yes.
She's asking, Professor, please, can there be cases where the different categories are less clear? For example, I've seen work on social environmental accounting with pragmatic emancipatory perspective.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And therefore potentially confusing to put these things in boxes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The limits.
Yeah, and even to give them numbers. You know, I apologize for that. Because yes, indeed, these things could be presented better in a way, in a sort of set theory where they all intersect.
Yeah, maybe we could do a diagram.
Yeah, you could present it like that, and you'd probably be giving a better representation of the situation, where you know that there's concepts, and in practice there will be overlap.
Yeah, and you can also have counter accounting intersecting with conventional accounting.
As illustrated.
You have a diagram with all of them intersecting.
They can all intersect. Yeah, they can. Social, environmental accounting, social environment, they can intersect. So that is absolutely correct. I'm glad that those questions have been asked, because I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that these are absolute
separate
categories that are mutually exclusive. This is not the Durham Morgan paradigm.
Yeah, it's not Durham Morgan. Good. Eu não sei se essa Luciana é a Luciana Holtz ou a Luciana Sardeiro. Não sei, porque ela só tem um nome aqui, não tem o sobrenome dela no YouTube.
Yeah, it's strange, you know, I put this into the computer, but maybe text has jumped around and I haven't noticed it. I'm just looking at the right hand side.
Luciana Sardeiro. It's Luciana from Rural University of Pará. Yeah, Luciana Sardeiro.
Thank you, Luciana. The notion that accounting is a financial economistic practice goes back a long time, but it has been variously expanded and contracted, including in the direction of social and environmental accounting. SEA means social and environmental accounting. We can think of some key moments in history in relation to that. I think in some ways this is one. This is prior to the formation of an established accountancy profession. But I think what's going on here, and I think you find it beyond Bentham, you find it throughout continental Europe for sure, and I'm sure you find it all over the world to some extent as well. And that is this intermingling of concerns about enlightenment, knowledge, statistics, accounting publicity, education, coming together at the same time. And people have written theses on, for example, education and state formation. And they're talking about the development of the modern state and modern society. All these things intermingling and interacting is a key moment, I think, in history and understanding accounting today. And of course, the writers I've been looking at linked to democracy, but you don't find that all the time. So a lot of the writers in continental Europe would not have been actually promoting democracy but they would have been promoting the linkage between education, accounting, maybe statistics, knowledge, enlightenment. They were typically known, for example, as enlightened absolutist writers. So they were actually supportive of the authoritarian leader, if you like, but they were wanting an enlightened development, if you see what I'm saying, beyond the democrat. They thought that it was best achieved without democracy. Catherine the Great is an example. I've mentioned Catherine the Great before. There is a debate about what she actually wrote herself, but there are texts signed by Catherine the Great that were really quite thick texts on administration, written in this kind of period.
And this point is really important because as we were chatting with colleagues yesterday from other universities, not only in Brazil but other countries in Latin America, our accounting education sometimes is too narrower to what experts define as accounting. And we don't have disciplines and courses tracing back to that kind of enlightenment and thinking of accounting in the society that any student should have. Despite they want to do conventional accounting, they should know that accounting can be broader and at large field of knowledge.
That's right, and it's really interesting how history can illuminate that. Because a lot of people, when they talk about ideas like social environmental or visibility, accounting and democracy, counter-accounting, they think all of that is 20th century or even late 20th century. There was a definite movement then, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But that occurred earlier in a way is interesting. And I think you could probably find things in South America. It's almost certain. I have mentioned, I think, to yourself, I mentioned it to Mary as well in Colombia. Bentham, for instance, had a correspondence with Simon Bolivar. There was a correspondence.
This is really nice,
which is interesting. Because, Bentham saw himself as a citizen of the world. He was trying to promote his ideas all over the world. And he was trying to help design constitutions for different parts of the world. He actually defined himself as a citizen of the world. By the way, the word international, I don't know what that is in Brazilian, is it international? International is from Bentham. He was the first person to use the word international. Just an international.
And it's interesting, Luciana that has posted here on YouTube. I was in her PhD committee. Luciana is studying the current movement of international financial standard boards in extracting all other publics from the definition of what accounting should do and to whom they should deliver the report, and she's analyzing the current framework. But you are saying that we can have a historical perspective dating back to a period in which accounting was defined as an at-large phenomenon.
That's correct. Luciana, is it Luciana you're talking about?
Luciana Sardello, yes.
Luciana's project sounds really interesting though, because maybe she'd agree with me, I don't know, but my understanding is that if you look at the preface and framework documents of the International Accounting Standards Board, you find definite shifts and changes since 1973. 1973 was the time when what was then known as the International Accounting Standards Steering Committee, I think it was known, and then it became the International Accounting Standards Committee. But the initial preface and framework was written in a context, 1973, which again was a key moment. I think it was a key moment because you had this idea that accounting was being developed for many stakeholders. And if you look at the original preface and framework, it doesn't refer to it being all about investors. Correct, Luciana, you might correct me if you're there online, but I don't think it does. I think it talks about users.
Yes, exactly.
That's what it does. Okay, it is constrained in terms of being very much about the financial conventional financial accounting. It's always been like that, the ISB, or the ISC, as I say. But later on, it starts to refer to investors, and then it says, investors, if you serve investors, it will serve everyone else.
Yeah.
If you serve investors, it will serve everybody else who has an interest in the financial statements.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of words they use.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it is.
The
And then more
supremacy of
recently,
investors.
yeah, and then more recently, it just says investors. Doesn't refer to others at all.
Yes, yes, yes.
So that's what Luciana may well pick up in our analysis. Now, it's a great thing to say because it overlaps exactly with what I wanted to say about key moments. Because
it is not a national phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon.
Yes.
With a huge impact in several geopolitical contexts.
it is. Now, interestingly enough, and I don't know again if Luciana's picking this up in her argument, but very, very recently they've started to refer to sustainability.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, it used to be the case that when David Tweedy, a very funny man, by the way, his jokes are not appropriate for YouTube, but he was a very funny man, actually, David Tweedy. David Tweedy should have been a comedian, not the president of the ISB. He should have been a comedian. But anyway, he was often at meetings, and there were academics there, and people would ask, what about social and environmental accounting? Why are you not going to make that a standard? Why are you not going to look into that area? And David Tweedy used to say, because he's very diplomatic, about these things, and he said, it's on our agenda, but actually it's fairly low down at the moment. That's what he always said. Oh, we're really busy about financial instruments.
I had a paper on that in 2007.
Oh, did you?
Saying that, yeah.
Did you have that quote from Tweedy about
Yeah,
it's on the agenda, but it's near the bottom?
They had an exposure draft on sustainability and climate change, and then at the end they said that's not the time. It's not priority, and it's
This is the language.
2022. We now have this.
This is the language they
the
use.
standards finally, how many
Yeah.
years? 2007.
A long time.
15 years.
15 years. Yeah, because we have this expression kicking into a long grass, so these ideas are often kicked into a long grass. Sometimes they kind of say, well, we agree it's important, but we hope someone else does it. And I've had conversations with people on the AISB committee about other areas of accounting, and they've said, oh yeah, we agree with you, but we're hoping someone else will do it. Why is that? Well, no one's going to follow our standards if we do what you say. People will list on stock exchanges where they don't require international standards. It's realpolitik. Now, it's not quite the case, to be honest. The argument's not that good, but I can appreciate there might be something in it. I just think the ISB is more powerful than they seem to think they are.
Yeah.
I think they've got potential now because they've become so big and so influential. That gives them potential to do something really good.
And there is an important aspect regarding this. They don't even know how important they are because they are not in the margins of capitalism.
No.
If they were here, they would know how our colonial mindset made us reproduce critically anything that comes from them and say everything that is international is better than what we have.
Yes.
The investors, they know everything, so
That's right.
We have a romantic view of this.
no, and the romantic view of what development is and should be. So
That's
we
right.
must follow what investments define as the best for the world. So we must
That's right.
follow.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the ISB itself could do a lot more on that. I agree that you've also got the issue both in terms of the local and the global interaction. But the ISB itself really ought to take that much more seriously. Again, they've just got a few throwaway lines in the pre-facing framework about context being different in different parts of the world. And the applicability of these standards, may vary in different parts of the world, but they then sort of go on and say, but it's not really relevant for financial matters, something like that. In other words, we've thought about that, but we don't think it's so important for financial accounting. So, I mean, they do say something like that. But, you know, they could take things a lot more seriously. I mean, one instance would be Islamic accounting, for example. You know, people talk about the need for changing the ISB accounting that would more satisfy the Islamic principle. Now, you can question whether that's a genuine Islamic principle or not, but this change that they're talking about is relatively minor, and the ISB doesn't do it.
Yeah.
It's a really minor thing for them, but they don't do it.
They don't want to acknowledge the other knowledge.
Yeah. So you know, I do think that I do think there's definitely something very much in that point. Okay, now I can't actually, I'm trying to read what this says here. Is accounting and this modification. Oh yes, I know what that means, yes. Right, but I'm not quite going to talk about that because I want to talk about the 1970s, coming from what Luciana was saying. You know, the 1970s was a really interesting moment as well in the history of accounting. Certainly in the UK, but I think you can find very similar things again throughout the world. What you've got in the 70s is an attempt by the government and the profession, with business corporations in tow as well, you know, they were all aligned on this, to change accounting, change the external accounting reports. And there was something produced in 1975 called the Corporate Report, which you will know already is. And the Corporate Report came out of a commissioned work by the accountancy professional bodies in the UK. So the accountancy professional bodies in the UK commissioned a committee to work on the future accounting report. And this document that they produced reads very radical compared with the accounting today. They talked about stakeholders, and this included stakeholders such as Friends of the Earth. They were one of the stakeholders they specifically referred to. So they talked about accounts serving all these different stakeholders, and therefore they were on the edge of suggesting that the accounts are more than the financial accounts. They talked a lot about employees. They had a lot of ideas about how accounting communications could better serve employee interests. And I remember when I was, because this was when I was, I have to think about this, I was actually 15 in 1975. And my father worked as a shop floor engineer in Bolton, in Manchester. And I remember he came home with a set of accounts, with the sort of report to the employees, because businesses were doing these accounts voluntarily. But the idea was that the corporate report would become an accounting standard. It was that kind of strong, you know, they wanted it to be an accounting standard. And the governments in Britain during the 70s, whether you're talking about Labour government or Conservative government, they were supporting these initiatives by and large. They were supporting these initiatives. And of course, you can interpret these initiatives in different ways. So if you look at the paper by Burchell et al., I think it's 1985, in Accounting Organisations and Society. It's a good paper. It is a really good paper. And what they try to do, they interpret this development as a kind of rhetoric, as a kind of almost like an ideology, which is trying to convince the labour interests to, be more productive. Because they were, just like today, there was a big talk about a productivity crisis in Britain at the time. And so they were arguing that if the workers and the unions could feel they were part of the cooperative, collaborative system, almost like a corporatist model, that they would actually be more productive because course of that. So they were arguing that actually you can have a very critical perspective on this. And I don't disagree that you can have a critical perspective on that, and there is something in it. But I also think there's something positive about what was happening in the 70s. I also think that there was incredibly a time when the profession were proposing to account better to employees. I think these are significant moments. And, you know, we may be able to return to these things one day. But you do find, if you look at the corporate report, I would encourage you to look at it and see what you think about what's in there. And you will find some. There's also a very interesting paper published, I think it was 86.
This paper from Virtual, Hopwood.
Yeah, there's a role of accounting in organizations and societies.
Yeah, and they are talking about accounting as an ammunition machine.
Yeah.
As an argumentative
Yeah, that's a good
machine.
paper as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the very early papers in AOS.
Yes.
Yes.
Paul Paulo, one of our former PhD
Yeah.
students, used that paper to discuss the role of accounting in political argumentation at the process of Dilma impeachment.
Yeah.
How
it's a good paper. You know, those are really inspiring papers.
Yeah.
Virtually till 1980, virtually till 1985. Very inspiring papers.
It's about the
written in the early days of AOS.
No, it is about the role of accounting, and they're discussing that accounting can be used as a legitimacy machine, as a argumentative tool.
Accounting has a language.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a notion of metaphors of
The metaphor.
Absolutely. Metaphor. Interesting work done on that as well. Okay, now just in terms of the right-hand side, it talks about expansions and contributions, because what I'm pointing out there is that conventional accounting has changed over time in different ways. And it's kind of, okay, thank you. It's kind of gone through what I would see as more progressive models and then more aggressive models. And you find this all the time occurring around accounting. It certainly challenges the view that accounting is just a technical practice, certainly to study these phenomena in history. What about some expansions and attributions? On the right-hand side, I'm talking about conventional accounting. And I'm saying that when people think about conventional accounting, they often think about historic cost accounting in financial accounting terms, which in practice is always modified historic cost accounting. You don't get pure historic cost accounting in practice. It's always a modification of it. Occasionally they will revalue the long-term assets, fixed assets, you know, whatever they are called these days. Yeah, they will revalue them, and therefore it's always modified historic cost in practice. Incidentally, just on that,
we have another comment from Luciana.
Okay.
Luciana was thanking you for commenting on the topics of her PhD thesis, and now she's mentioning that the strangest thing is to talk about sustainability and not be concerned about how the company impacts the environment. People in countries most affected by weather events are outside the ISSB's discussion.
Yes.
What matters are future cash flow projections. So they are disregarding what really matters for several contextual.
Yeah. In other words, you can try to capture a word and give it a known understanding, and give it a known meaning. And that's more or less what's going on. Now, again, you can interpret that as a kind of movement, a kind of shift that is a positive one, but at the same time, something that's being captured. You know?
Yes,
the
it
two
is
things go on together.
something else.
Yeah, the two things go together. So, you know, if I know, for example, Rob, before unfortunately Rob died, he was very cynical about what the ISB were trying to do. And you probably got his email when he wrote around the world, you know, using all these expletives about the ISB. You remember that one? And then I think someone like Carol Adams, for example, took the view of, oh, maybe there's a little movement here, maybe we've got something to push against, you know, and has been more participated in the project. But yeah, I mean, she's right. Luciana is right. I mean, it is such a pity that it's such a limited step at this stage. Maybe it will lead to something else, Luciana. That's the point. Maybe it will lead to something else. Okay. Historic cost accounting and its modification. Again, the past throws some very interesting things up if you look at this. When the very early companies, well, let's say early 19th century, which again is a period I've studied in detail, but you know, the companies producing accounts around that time, they were definitely trying to do something like economic value, current value as they saw it. You know, they weren't using historic cost. And so it's a bit of a myth to think that historic cost is the traditional kind of accounting system. It's never actually been a big thing in practice. It's always a modified form of it. But it became particularly prevalent, or it was emphasized, after about the 1880s, when the accountancy professional bodies were in full swing, when there was a much more significant professionalization of accountancy. I think the English Institute was formed in 1880, maybe 1880 or 1880 something. And they emphasized a very conservative approach to accounting, you know, prudence and countering companies' attempts to exaggerate their profits and exaggerate their assets and underestimate their liabilities. And that kind of introduced this very conservative approach, and historic costs went along with that. Historic costs plus things like depreciation, you know, to reduce these things even more. And then, of course, we've had all kinds of movements where different accounting has been promoted. We've seen big moments in the 1930s where academics were pushing for even present value accounting. You know, that was a big thing in the 1930s in the UK. And they were laughed at by companies, they were laughed at by practice. The idea of producing present value accounts was seen as a silly idea. Later on, you know, the academics influencing the International Accounting Standards Board, taking this kind of income theory perspective, and you talked about that the other day, you know, income theory, a kind of theory, you know, and it's basically trying to develop accounting and make it more representative of the economic. Something that Jeremy Bentham did as well. You know, many of the things we've seen occurred at that time as well. But yeah, notions of current value. So you get writers who talk about trying to change the assets and liabilities to replacement cost figures. They might talk about changing the figures to net realizable value or market value. They might even talk about changing the figures to present value of these figures. And actually, current accounts of the International Accounting Standards Board are a kind of mixture of all these things in practice. Present value is used now in the valuation of various assets and liabilities. Replacement cost maybe less so, but market value certainly is used a lot in valuing investments, for instance. And the word FACC is used in relation to value, I think because they didn't want to use what they kind of meant. I mean, they really meant something like present value, I think, which then was approximated by market value. But neither of those things are very acceptable to disclose to the world, you know, as your principle. So they thought fair value was much better. The word fair is used rhetorically in all kinds of different contexts, you know, like the fair play rules in football. Nothing to do with fair play. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you know, fair is used a lot by accountants. True and fair. By the way, when I say fair, it reflects my Lancashire heritage. Most people in the UK would say fair. I say fair. As in fur, you know. Yeah, also inflation accounting was something that was provisional standard at one point in the 70s. So there was a lot going on in the 70s, both in terms of the economic accounting side and the social, environmental side as well. There were also combinations, and that means, for example, combinations of current value accounting systems with inflation accounting systems. There was something called fully stabilized current value accounting system. I don't know if you remember that. And there were people proposing multi-columnar accounting. All of these things are worth studying, really. You know, I mean, multi-columnar accounting literally means don't just produce one set of accounts, produce several. That's what it means. And if you think about it, when current cost accounting was introduced in the UK, that was a form of multi-columnar accounting. The way that worked is the modified historic cost accounts were the main accounts, and current cost accounts, which were more or less replacement cost accounts, with a few very strange adjustments that didn't make a lot of sense. In the appendix to the account, they were put in the appendix to the account. So there were two sets of accounts that you could look at. And of course, all kinds of arguments then come about, you know, people being confused about the cost of these activities. Although the interesting thing is, they're going to be confused by the accounts anyway. You know, it's almost more honest to confuse them even more by suggesting that there might be different profits and values for the assets. It's almost more honest to do that. But maybe there are ways of articulating these issues that are more comprehensive. Maybe you have to use narratives a lot more to try to explain, you know, what is the likelihood of this value holding, for instance, so, you know, issues about that. And, what is the likelihood of this company failing, for instance, based on different contexts? Is this representation of value reasonable? Why is it that the share price multiplied by the number of shares issued, which is called market capitalization, is different from the capital value of the accounts? Why? Can you explain that? Why is it different why is it more different for some companies than it is in others? Why is it more different in some sectors than it is in others? By the way, you can link this to critical thinking as well, because the Monopolies and Mergers Commission in the UK actually were quite keen on developing current value accounting because they thought that goodwill in the context of which only actually occurs in consolidation, in consolidated accounting, but could in principle apply to other accounting as well, if you introduce non-purchase goodwill. But the goodwill that applies in consolidated accounting could be a measure of monopoly or oligopoly. So if the goodwill figure is high and it stays high all the time, why is that happening? Is it because of monopoly or oligopoly? You know, especially if you've got all the current values in your assets and liabilities. You can't argue that it's because of the values of those different things. And then some people say, yeah, but there's a synergy effect of all the assets and liabilities together. And so part of the problem there is that you're not including all the assets and liabilities in the accounts. You know, so brands, human capital, whatever it is, are not being included in the accounts. But if you include everything that could have a value in principle, and there's still a balance over called goodwill, and then over time it doesn't really go down, that's a suggestion of monopoly or oligopoly. Interesting, you know, so you can link these attempts at the micro level to revalue business to concerns about whether the business is exploiting the marketplace.
And it's interesting, your suggestion is that we can use conventional accounting numbers to challenge conventional accounting norms and ways of doing things.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. That's really interesting. Using conventional accounting numbers to challenge things that are not envisaged in the initial formulation of the standards or the accounting principles. And I mentioned Stiglitz. Stiglitz wrote something really very clever about accounting. and he said, if this accounting is public, no one can really control how it's going to be used. So other people will use it, the people you didn't intend to use it, and they will use it from their perspective with their interests in mind, which is what happens, you know. But I mean, again, if you go back to the 80s, it was in the 80s that there was that big dispute between the government and the National Union of Miners in the UK, so a big debate about coal and whether the coal industry was profitable. Now, in that context, accounting information was used. And what happened in that context was that the unions just did not trust the accounting, did not trust it. So you had a group of academics, you had some from Cambridge, you had some from Sheffield, and they went speaking to not just the coal board and the government, but also to the miners and to the unions representing the miners. And the main union representing the miners and all the various people around the leadership, they didn't want to look at the accounts because they didn't trust it. They said, that's not for us. You know? And so that's very interesting, you know, that this failure to engage in dialogue with all the different stakeholders can result in things like that, where people will make very key decisions based on distrust of something that they could have got something out of. And in fact, the people from Sheffield and Cambridge were trying to help the miners in that particular context. You know, that's the reality. They were actually trying to help them. And you see different contexts. For instance, in Germany, there was a lady called Ingrid Schreiber-Langer, who was very high in the union movement in Germany, was on various boards of directors, advising the unions on accounting, you know. This is a very different context to have. And the unions were actually, they saw her as someone who would genuinely advise them on accounting issues. And again, that goes back, it's a kind of German tradition, you know, which you haven't really found in the UK. But as I say, in the 70s, it looked as though that might be about to emerge as a kind of more of a tradition. We've got internal and external accounting referred to there. Again, the basic difference between those two is that the external accounting, which I've been mainly talking about, of course, in this presentation, is the accounting that is made visible to the world. Although, again, you've got to be careful when you hear that, because how easy is it to access in some companies and in some jurisdictions or in some pieces of legislation or in some standards, the information is only available to a registry. You might even have to pay to access it. You know, you've got to be careful to analyze these things. But internal accounting is traditionally regarded as secret within the organization. But, you know, by the way, external accounting involves secrecy too. When you make certain things visible, at the same time you make other things not visible. And you've got to analyze what is disclosed and what is not disclosed, and what is aggregated and what is disaggregated, to fully appreciate what's going on in something like external accounting. But pragmatically, external accounting and accountability systems do have to have space for a certain degree of secrecy too. Although Bentham probably wouldn't have accepted that idea, it is a pragmatic idea, unless, for instance, you don't see any value in competition between businesses. Because what you do, if you disclose too much information, you actually make it less difficult for companies to compete. You actually make it easier for them to collaborate as monopolies and oligopolies. You're actually doing some of the work for them to make it easier for them to collude if you disclose too much information. So, you know, there is and of course, transparency systems in practice always involve some distortion. You know, there is transparency and transparency. You know, when people call for transparency, and often progressive people call for transparency, you know, they don't really realize that in practice it's a mixture of things that go on, that you've got the emancipatory and repressive forces going on with these changes. And these things happen with counter-accounting. I'll talk about counter-accounting a bit later. Aggregations and another thing about external accounting that link, people talk about the difference between the two. I accept the difference between the two. But you can use external accounting in a similar way to internal accounting. If you think about internal accounting as a kind of control system that's operating within the firm, you can also think about the external accounting system in a similar way. You can try to use the external accounting communication system to shape your environment, and in that sense control the organization. So instead of just accepting what the environment, and I'm using the environment in the sense of context now. So instead of just accepting the context that you have, you try to shape it. Now, of course, that can be done with bad intentions, trying to fool people, trying to distort the image of the company, but it could also, in principle, be done because you are doing something genuinely good. Maybe you're trying to sell a product that's genuinely good, or a service that's genuinely good, and you just want to communicate it more to the world, so that people will actually tend to invest in you, and customers will come to you and buy. The ethical consumerism movement, the ethical investment movement, all those movements that go back a long time. Those movements are definitely evident in the 19th century in Britain for sure. You could, in fact, when Tony Law was writing about management control back in the early 70s, he had a view which was arguably a very naive view that companies would respond to the world around them and the pressures being put upon them in the world by genuinely becoming more ethical and by getting messages out to these different stakeholder constituencies so that it would help them to sustain and grow themselves in an ethical way because of that external communication. Uniting the external information, the internal information within the same notion of management control, making a unity between them. Of course, this is one of the areas where Tinker and Law argue with each other because Tinker soon decided that actually companies never really behaved like that, or that was a minority activity, or it wasn't enough. And a lot of people would agree that it's not enough. In the sense that companies will do those things, but they will also try to mislead and they will try to compromise their principles. If they are genuinely very ethical, in practice, they will have to compromise their principles because of competition. Sometimes, ironically, the larger organizations that are more monopolistic and oligopolistic have more scope to engage in socially responsible activity because there's less competition around their activities. By the way, I don't know if you know, there was that famous book published in the 1930s in the US about the goal of the firm, arguing that, people. Can you remember this one?
Dos anos 70 que fala dos objetivos da firma.
Possibly, yeah. Who are the authors of that?
They are the accountants. They must remember. Which book is that? I don't know this book.
There is a book in the 30s which was basically arguing that the goal of the firm should be about maximizing profits.
Berlin means?
Yes, Berlin means. Now, so when I say that, you realize it's Berlin means.
Theory of the firm.
Theory of the firm. But actually, Berlin means writes something very different in that book from that idea. If you actually read Berlin means, they're basically saying, large companies have the possibility, like monopolistic companies, have the possibility of being more socially responsible, and it's not a bad thing. That's what they say.
The name of the book. The responsibility of the firm.
But certainly Berlin means, that's what I wanted to get at the authors.
This is a critique that I have, because accountants nowadays does not know the origins in economic theory of the discussion they are having in accounting.
Absolutely.
They don't
So-
bring back
so-
early means in the 30s and
Yeah.
theory of the firm.
Other
I said,
people-
if you are contributing to the economy theory, you must read economic theory, you know? Even if you're doing a study in conventional accounting.
Other people have misread Berlin means, and it's going to be repeated all the way through. You know, whether right or wrong, Berlin means basically said that large organizations that were monopolies or oligopolies had the space to be more socially responsible, and it wasn't a bad thing. That's what they said. Okay. Aggregations and representations. By aggregations, I'm referring to things like consolidated accounts, and I mentioned this the other day, that consolidated accounts arguably improve the representation of large economic organizations that have many investments in other companies. However, they also involve hiding things. They also involve aggregations. Sometimes it will be quite nice to know more of the detail of the relationship between all these organizations that can be centers of tax avoidance, for instance, and what you might call aggressive tax avoidance. And because we can't see the relationships between all these different companies, we miss that information. It's hidden. So sometimes apparent improved representations, which consolidation appears to be, involve hiding things at the same time. Yet, users and uses, forms, status, timings, and networkings. These are all dimensions that can be used to analyze accounting in practice, conventional accounting in practice, and can be traced as things that you can analyze in terms of change. Do the users change? Do the uses change? How is accounting practice currently used? Who uses it today? What forms does the accounting take, and has that changed, and is that significant? The status or the aura, if you like, of accounting, has that changed? What is it today? The timings, you know, when is information actually disclosed, and is information typically out of date anyway by the time people get this information? Is that an issue in terms of accounting for decisions and accountability? Actually, that distinction between accounting for decisions and accounting for accountability is itself a little bit of a rhetorical type statement. I don't know if you've thought about this, but you know, accounting that is for accountability is also kind of for decisions. It's about decisions and control. That's the generic idea that accounting is part of, decisions and control, or even just control. You know, that's what accounting is really all about. And you know, the idea that there's something called accountability that's separate for decisions is a little bit rhetorical, almost like you're trying to suppress one of them and promote the other one. And then, yeah, the networkings. I talked here about the relationship between education, democracy, statistics, enlightenment, and accounting. Well, similarly, accounting today and over time has had a network around it of linkages, which are kind of important for understanding it and certainly understanding its potential. And then the notion of whether the accounting information is audited or not. There were huge periods when these things were not audited, and periods when they are, but still we have lots of information today that's published by companies that's not audited, or it's audited voluntarily. Having said all that, some of these distinctions are exaggerated. You know, if we talk about the idea that certain accounting information is required by law, certain accounting information is required by standards, certain accounting information is produced voluntarily, we overlook the sense in which there is a similarity between those three forms, three instances, as well as differences between them. Let's look at the first one. Accounting produced by law. Accounting regulated and prescribed by law. Yes, but what does that mean in practice? Do they follow the law? And how do they interpret the law? So you've got to look at these things very carefully to kind of understand what the practice means. If you're trying to understand the system, which you think is a prescribed system by law, what does it mean in practice? What is the nature of the law? A lot of laws seem to rely on expert judgments in our area of accounting. So what does that mean? Similarly, when you talk at the other end of the scale about voluntary disclosures, in what sense are they really voluntary? Are they motivated by a concern to look good? You know, this kind of thing. Are they motivated by a distortion effect? Are they motivated through a genuine concern to be ethical and better in some sense? And to convince people, you know, in that way? Are they motivated because of competition and the other companies are doing something, so we better do it? Are they motivated because they're trying to avoid some legislation down the line or some changes in the standard setting? If we do it, they won't impose the laws. And, you know, you find negotiation all the way with these kind of issues. So I was speaking to directors of large companies and talking about accounting regulations. And they said, actually, it's great. We're the good guys. We're the good guys. We can do all this that you're suggesting, but don't audit it. That's really what they said. Don't audit it. Just we'll produce this information, but don't require it to be audited. Or perhaps go for the limited assurance category of audit. There is a category of audit in the international auditing standards, which is limited assurance. And some companies realize that kind of audit is not a full audit. But of course, some people see auditing as not very strong anyway in the external sphere, for sure. You know, they don't think it's particularly strong. But again, even a limited assurance audit and a commitment to that is better than nothing. You have to interpret these things in terms of the bigger picture, I think, rather than simply always thinking negative about these things. You know, because the danger is, if you think negative about these things, they might just disappear and you're back to a situation where these possibilities are much smaller. I mean, there are people out there in our critical area who believe that it's great if you know, the more capitalistic principles are effective. It's great if the more powerful people exploit the less powerful. Why? Because there's more likely to be a revolution. You know, there are people who think like that. Now, I honestly think that this is a strange way of thinking. And I go back to the point that, Leclerc's point, that you can't go from an imperfect system to a perfect system overnight. You're just going to find imperfections carrying on. And okay, you can assess the two systems and try to evaluate which one is better or better and so on. But it's much better to realize that you need to pragmatically, progressively change. You need to have real progressive change, not the pretense of change. Real progressive change. That's what you need. This is interesting as well in that respect. Now, this is on conventional social and environmental accounting. So, in relation to your point, Yara, earlier, I've actually grouped these two things together because I'm talking about them as an expanded category, because they are often things where the business organizations themselves have decided to do these things, or they are things that are regulated by the government. So, they are not things that are done by NGOs or so-called independent groups in the sense of shadow accounting and counter accounting. And I'm raising questions in relation to corporate power, in relation to formal government power, and in relation to the standard setters. And I'm thinking of standard setters such as the IASB, but you could actually analyze this from the point of view of other kinds of standard setters, including in the social and environmental accounting area. First of all, how powerful are these groups? I don't think they have absolute power. I don't think any of them have absolute power. You know, corporations, governments and standard setters. I really don't think they have absolute power. They have relative power, and the large transnational corporations have a lot of relative power in the world. And that's a pity in some sense, but it doesn't mean they're all bad. It doesn't mean that everything they do is bad. That would be a strange argument to make. Again, standard setters, again, no formal absolute power. Are they an agency of government? That's an interesting question, because standard setters definitely have this sense of realpolitik. In fact, one of the members of the International Accounting Standards Board, who was very sympathetic to some of the ideas I was proposing at the time, said, yes, I agree with you, but, realpolitik. We can't do that, realpolitik. We operate in the context in which we operate in. We want to become powerful. We want to become influential. We, the International Accounting Standards Board, want to be influential. And if we're going to be influential, we can't constantly upset business and government. We're going to have to compromise, negotiate. So that's what they do. Of course, they wouldn't say that in the framework or the preface, which is the point, Luciana might be studying those things. You will not find them writing in the preface or the framework, we have to compromise. We have to be pragmatic. We can't always provide the information that even investors want, And actually that's a balance. That's a balance, because investors typically do want more information than they get from companies. But even the investors themselves realize there's a limit to what they would want, because there's a value in secrecy for the companies. So that's a balance. And again, you won't find that in the framework or the preface. Oh, we realize that in order for value to be preserved in companies, they can't be that transparent. We realize that. They don't say that. Actually, the nearest they get to that kind of admission would be if they refer to the costs of the standards. The costs of the disclosure. That these things are a burden on companies, and we have to think about the costs. They do refer to that, which is going beyond the standard economics treatment of information, which is just there. It's costless. Unless you're an information economist, like Stiglitz, for instance, you're going to regard information as kind of not really costly. It's just there.
So, what can we correlate that transparency creates some sort of transaction costs?
Yes.
As in transaction cost theory?
Yes, it does. I mean, the information and the production of information involves costs, all kinds of different costs. Now, they might be exaggerated.
Yeah, and those costs are related to the interaction between all actors and the contracts and...
Yeah, got no impact on the whole array of costs. As I say, you do occasionally get reference to that. Usually not in the preface or framework, but if you look at, for example, the reports on, say, committees that have decided on standards, if you look at that and the rationale for the decisions to support something or to oppose it, they will say, oh, this is very costly on companies. So even though the information might actually be beneficial, it's fairly marginal and the cost is high. So we're not going to support that. They do occasionally write that. They do occasionally use that argumentation. Now, when people make submissions to the standard setters, they will definitely stress those points. This is going to be bad for competition. This is costly. They definitely do that. Very commonly, actually. So commonly that it's a bit like the case of the boy who cried wolf. Have you heard that expression? The boy who cried wolf. Every day they're saying, oh, there's a wolf. There's a wolf. And of course, the wolf never came. So when a wolf finally did come, everybody ignored them. Everybody ignored the boy. And in a similar way, companies complain so much about those things, like a routine thing. put your submission in, they don't like the fact that this is costly and so on. And then they do apply it, and it doesn't appear to affect them that much. It doesn't appear to be very costly. That when something really is significant for them, people would ignore it. So actually, governments and standard setters often ignore companies complaining. They often ignore it, actually. I have found that in practice. It's almost like just the rhetoric that companies use to say, oh, don't control us too much, but I've known governments of all persuasions kind of saying, oh, that's just companies, that's what they say. They always say that, So that is part of what happens as well. We can also consider the ethics of corporations, the ethics of governments. My point is that, yes, we can talk about relative situation here. We can talk about corporations having lots of negative impacts, environmental, for example. But, the people running corporations are themselves human beings, believe it or not. Okay, I'm going to make this point. They are human beings. The people running the governments are human beings. I know it's difficult to believe sometimes. I know that, but they are. And the point is, there is a mixture, and people change over time as well. And so you can, to a certain extent, achieve some kind of progressive changes through working with things from the position that they are currently. The problem we've got in the world today is that there's some really serious issues that we need to act upon fast. That's a big problem. And we've had some serious issues like that for some time now, in the social sphere and the environmental sphere. These are big issues. And we have not been quick enough to get on top of these issues, and that's an extremely dangerous situation. In that particular context, all you can do is try to use the potentially very significant power of governments throughout the world. That would be my suggestion. Because if you leave it to corporations or standard setters, I think they just, in the final analysis of the global level, they don't quite have the power to do it. It's too uncoordinated. Yes, they can contribute in a positive way. Corporations, different standard setters, individuals, individuals can contribute to the kind of problems we've got in the world. Yes, they can, and they do. Many people do. But is it enough? Probably not. And therefore, you need a strong, coordinated action by government throughout the world. That would be my view. That's my view. That's my, if you like, confession of submitting to government power. But it's a very difficult challenge. I mean, if you remember the financial crisis, they really did try to work together to resolve the financial crisis at a global level, and they made a lot of progress on that. It was a major achievement in a way. If you can do it for that, why can they not do it in relation to the environment? This is needed, and it's needed by an appreciation of the problem on the one hand, because the problem suggests a relatively simple solution in a way, but also all the obstacles to resolving the problem. To try to appreciate it and to try to diplomatically achieve the solutions to it. Because if you do, you open up the possibility of other things. You open up the possibility of a better world more generally. That's what you do. And you don't need a world government to do that. You just need something that acts as a world government. You don't necessarily need a world government, but you need something that acts as a world government. I know a lot of people are worried about the idea of a world government. A lot of people are worried about that. And it's incredibly difficult to achieve. So, some of the things that could be realistic propositions are so difficult to achieve. But the idea of governments getting together and coordinating, that is a possibility. That's the best hope, I think, for achieving the things that really matter to us in the world. Dynamics is mentioned there because you've got the idea of change resulting, for example, in more or less corporate power, more or less government power, more or less power to the standard setters. Interesting with standard setters, you've also got this issue of the power of professional expertise. And I don't know if I actually made this point on the previous slide. Accounting is determined by the professional experts. If you look at the European Union, it's almost as though there is a discourse, or accounting, that's what the ISP do. Accounting, that's ISP. Anything else is not accounting. You've probably seen this. Non-financial reporting, right? Financial reporting is ISP. Non-financial is nothing to do with the ISP. And this is actually problematic because there are forms of financial accounting that the ISP does not do, for instance. So it falls down a hole in between. Yeah, it's kind of what they call an institutional void. It falls down the hole and it gets less attention, and sometimes it's accepted without discussion, or sometimes it's not actually implemented because it doesn't fit the categories. These are interesting issues, about key issues, really. About key issues,
Jim, it is a fantastic discussion you're having.
Is it time?
This is half hour past midday. It's 12:30.
So that is.
We are about 2 hours and 20 minutes session. Maybe we could.
Right. It's supposed to be 1.5 hours.
Yes. I know it is an amazing topic, and we are all enthusiastic about it. But maybe for people in the YouTube, it's hard to follow. And
yeah, it would be, yes.
Yeah, maybe 10.
I've started to talk very quickly as well, in spite of my determination not to. Yeah, you're right. I think I've talked about country counting before.
Yeah, maybe
for profit spends, it's a Gramscian idea. But to me, it is just an attempt to challenge the established order, which has its own imperfections, I would say.
And the idea of hegemony.
Yeah, that's right. And my hegemony is counter hegemony. And my thought is that all the different accountings can also function as counter accounting as well. Dialogue accounting, the idea of engaging different stakeholders and parties in dialogue around accounting. Julie Brown are very good on this aspect. Notions of linking accounting and democracy, the plurality of emancipatory progressive projects, identities and interests. So you've got, say, accounting for indigenous culture, or you've got accounting, say, for Maori, for example, in New Zealand, so Maori accounting. So you can find lots of interesting stuff being proposed and going on in the accounting realm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. I should thank you.
No, it is amazing how your lecture today connects all the 3 previous ones.
Yes.
From methods and emancipatory and participators to delineation. Yeah, of the object, yeah.
And also to read out.
Thank you, Jim, for your presentation today. I asked all the colleagues that are following here in person or on YouTube to be with us on the 3rd, August the 3rd, the session with the in the morning. Yes, the last and final one. I won't be here, but Tawan will probably be, Yara, Lucas, everyone. Yeah, hosting the session with
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thank you, Andrea, for holding the session.